Picture a quiet room in the capital in the year 88. No shouting crowd. No packed courtroom. No heroic last speech. Just a sealed wax tablet in a messenger's hand, and a famous man realizing that the world has moved without him. The man is Ovid, a star of Roman literary society. In the social world of dinner parties and public recitations, his lines are the kind people repeat to sound clever. The messenger is official, calm, practiced, almost bored. That contrast is the first lesson. In this system, life-changing power can arrive with the emotional temperature of routine. It doesn't have to feel violent to be absolute. Ovid breaks the seal. He reads. The choice disappears. He is ordered into exile, sent far away to Tomis on the Black Sea. And notice what is missing. There is no public vote he can rally, no trial scene where the best speech wins, no dramatic appeal to the people moment. There is only the center, and the fact that the center has already decided. In a world that still advertises Republican forms, the decisive move can still land like paperwork. Ovid will later write from exile again and again, trying to pull his life back toward Rome. Those poems and letters are our anchor because they are primary evidence. He tells us he was exiled. He tells us he is pleading. He tells us he is cut off. He also gives a famously cryptic explanation for why it happened, a poem and an error, Carmen et error. And he never fully explains the error. That's where we have to be honest. Modern historians debate what that error was, and the surviving evidence does not let us pin it down with certainty. That uncertainty is itself a feature of power. When the rules and the reasons are hazy, people second-guess themselves, and gatekeepers gain room to decide. But here is what we can say with confidence. The mechanism that hits Ovid is real, documented, and it is exactly the mechanism that governed countless ordinary lives too. Because the real question today isn't, was the emperor powerful? That's easy. The real question is, who controlled the system beyond the emperor? Who controlled the gates that decide what your options are day to day? That's why this episode is called, Who Truly Controlled Rome Beyond the Emperors? If you want to understand power, don't start with a statue. Start with a gate. Start with the people who decide who gets access, who gets heard, whose paperwork moves, whose petition gets delayed, and whose reputation gets quietly managed until it collapses. Power is often a chain of small decisions that add up to one big outcome. Under Augustus, the old Republican stage is still visible. The Senate still meets. Elections still happen. Magistracies still exist. The city still looks and sounds like Rome. Augustus even presents his rule as a restoration, not a demolition. But the center of gravity has moved. One man holds bundled authority and unmatched prestige, and that means the path to outcomes increasingly runs through the center. And when outcomes flow from a center, access becomes the most valuable resource in the empire. Now here's the twist. Access is rarely controlled by the emperor's own hands. Augustus does not personally stand at every doorway. He does not personally read every petition, hear every rumor, or schedule every audience. Instead, access is controlled by people, secretaries, clerks, attendants, doorkeepers, messengers, friends of friends, an entire human interface between society and the center. That interface is where beyond the emperor becomes real. If they decide you are not today, you are not today. Ovid learns this immediately. If he wants relief, he needs a pathway back to the center. That means letters, intermediaries, patrons, introductions, and careful phrasing. In other words, he must play the game of access. And there's a dark comedy here. An empire that conquered continents can still make your fate hinge on whether the right person actually puts your letter on the right pile. And if a celebrated poet must play that game to survive, what do you think a shopkeeper, a veteran, a widow, or a provincial town council had to do? That's why Ovid is a perfect guide. He is famous enough that we have a record, and powerless enough, once the gates close, that we can see the machinery at work. So here's our plan for the next 30 minutes. We'll use Ovid's exile as a true, documented hook. Someone loses a choice, and then we'll peel back the layers of the machine that made that loss feel normal. We'll identify 5 main controllers beyond the emperor: the imperial household that filters access, patronage networks that move favors and credibility, administrators and clerks who translate rules into daily reality, senatorial elites adapting to new incentives, and the managers of stability, security, and supply, who keep the city calm enough that most people choose adaptation over confrontation. We'll keep our camera on the doors, not just the throne. And as we move, keep asking one practical question. Who can say yes, who can say no, and who can simply make you wait? In Rome, wait was often the most decisive word in the room, without apology. One more promise: we will not invent scenes that didn't happen. We will stay in the early empire, in Rome under Augustus, and we will be clear where the evidence is firm and where scholars disagree. Because the story is already dramatic enough. A single sealed tablet can send a famous man to the edge of the world. The real shock is that it doesn't require a spectacle. It requires a system, and a lot of people who know how to operate it. When a modern viewer hears exile, they expect a single dramatic moment. A judge bangs a gavel, the condemned is marched away, the crowd gasps. But in early imperial Rome, punishment could look like administration. A decision at the top becomes real because a chain of people makes it real. That chain is where beyond the emperor starts to matter. Think about what Ovid's next move has to be. He cannot vote his way back. He cannot sue the state in a neutral court. He cannot just show up at the palace door and demand 5 minutes. What he can do, what he actually does in his surviving writing, is build a pathway. He writes. He pleads. He flatters. He asks friends to speak for him. He tries to reframe himself as harmless, loyal, and worthy of mercy. That isn't just personal desperation. It's a map of power. In the early empire, a huge amount of governance works through petitions and requests. People ask for decisions, for exceptions, for clarifications, for favors, for relief. The center replies, sometimes yes, sometimes no, sometimes with silence. But the key point is practical. Before a request becomes an answer, it becomes a file, and before it becomes a file, it becomes something a human being chooses to pass along. So who are those human beings? Start with the imperial household. Household sounds domestic, like servants and dinner. In Rome, it also means administration, secretaries who draft responses, clerks who register documents, attendants who manage the physical space, doorkeepers who decide who gets inside, and messengers who control timing. They do not need the emperor's full authority to shape outcomes. If they control the gate, they control the flow. And flow is power. Imagine a day at the center. People show up with requests. Some are senators. Some are equestrians. Some are city councils from Italy. Some are veterans asking for a grant. Some are business people trying to protect a contract. Not everyone can be seen. Not everyone can even be acknowledged. That scarcity of attention, of time, of access creates a market. And the household staff are the brokers in that market. They decide which request gets read today, which gets filed for later, and which never reaches the inner room. This is why the most important word in an authoritarian-ish system is often not no, it's later. Come back. We'll see. It's being processed. Those phrases don't start a rebellion. They start exhaustion. And exhaustion makes people negotiate, not fight. Now add patronage. If the household are the gatekeepers, patrons are the people who can walk you to the gate and vouch for you. In a society obsessed with status, a recommendation is not a cute favor. It is a translation device. It turns your request into something legible and safe. A patron's name signals, this person matters, this person is connected, this person will remember how you were treated. That changes behavior without a single threat. For Ovid, this is life or death. He writes to friends who have social standing. He asks them to read his work, to present his case, to soften the image of him at the center. We don't have to invent secret meetings to understand what is happening. A letter is a bid for access. A friendship is a possible lever. A patron is a possible key. And here's a clean joke that is also true. In Rome, the shortest distance between 2 points was often not a straight line. It was a mutual acquaintance. If that sounds familiar, congratulations, human nature has not evolved much in 2,000 years. So, beyond the emperor, who controls Rome in this slice of the story? The people who control access and the people who control introductions. The household shapes the gate. The patronage network shapes who can approach the gate without being ignored, and who gets answered first. And once you see that, you start noticing how policy becomes personal. Not because the emperor is whimsical, but because the system is run by humans with discretion, priorities, and incentives. And notice how this distributes power. A secretary who drafts a reply is not just writing. The draft is the decision's first shape. A clerk who logs a petition is not just recording. The log determines whether it exists. A doorkeeper who decides you can wait in an inner corridor is not just guarding a door. That doorway is the line between being a person and being a problem. This also helps explain why so many Romans pursued honor in ways that look obsessive. If access is the currency, then status is the bank account. Your toga stripe, your previous office, the people who greet you, the clients at your door, these are signals. They tell gatekeepers how risky it is to ignore you. They tell everyone else whether you are safe to help. And the system trains people to think this way, because thinking this way is how you survive. We can't see every conversation that happened behind the curtain, but we can see the logic in the sources, appeals, recommendations, requests to remember, and careful self-presentation. Power leaves fingerprints, even when it hides its hands. In the next segment, we're going to widen out how this gatekeeping model reshaped the Senate and elite competition, and how the administrative class, often equestrian, made the new order feel routine. Because once the gate becomes the center, the whole political culture reorganizes around it. Now widen the lens. If the gates of access are real, they don't just shape individual pleas like Ovid's. They reshape the entire elite culture, including the Senate. And the trick is that the Senate does not vanish. It keeps meeting, debating, judging, and performing the ancient rituals of public life. That continuity is part of the genius of the early Principate. The stage stays familiar, while the direction of outcomes shifts. Under the Republic, competition among elites was loud and risky. Elections mattered, coalitions mattered, and political violence had become a recurring feature of the late 1st century BC. Augustus presents himself as ending that cycle. He promises order, stability, and a return to normal. But stability comes with a new incentive structure. If you are an ambitious senator, you still want honor, office, and prestige. The difference is that now your career path increasingly depends on how you sit within the senator's favor, or at least within the senator's comfort zone. This is why Beyond the Emperor includes senatorial elites themselves. Not because they secretly run the emperor, but because they become operators of the new equilibrium. They set the tone of what is safe to say. They model the behavior that gets rewarded. They teach younger men how to survive. Less grandstanding, more prudence, fewer public feuds, more private alignment. The result is a kind of soft discipline, where people police themselves because the rewards and risks are predictable. One of the most effective tools in this system is appointment. In a competitive aristocracy, being chosen matters. It signals favor. It opens doors. It shapes who will listen to you next month. If the center can influence appointments, directly or indirectly, it can shape the entire political ecosystem without making a public show of force. The Senate can still vote, still debate, still issue decrees, but everyone knows which direction the wind blows, and everyone knows that sailing with the wind is safer than lecturing the wind about Republican purity. Now, look at the administrative layer that makes all of this feel routine. A massive city and a vast empire do not run on speeches. They run on schedules, audits, grain deliveries, tax records, legal decisions, and logistics. Under Augustus, a great deal of crucial work is handled by officials outside the traditional senatorial track, often from the equestrian order. These men manage systems, supply, finance, public order, and the flow of information. They are not less important because their titles are less glamorous. In practice, they are the ones who make rules bite. This is another way Rome is controlled beyond emperors. If you can shape how rules are applied, strictly, flexibly, quickly, slowly, you shape lives. You can stop a petition by asking for one missing document. You can speed one up by interpreting a phrase generously. You can bury someone in procedure without ever raising your voice. And because this looks like administration, not oppression, it is harder to resist without looking like you are resisting order itself. This is also why Ovid's Exile is such a sharp case study. Exile is not just a destination. It is a process. Notices, permissions, timelines, property implications, and communication limits. Each step touches an official. Each official has discretion, even if it is small. And small discretion, repeated across many desks, becomes a large force. And notice how this normality is created. It is created in rooms where nothing dramatic happens, in a session where a senator decides not to push a motion, in a dinner where someone changes the topic, in a courthouse where a magistrate interprets a rule a little more cautiously than he would have 20 years earlier. These are not Hollywood moments, but they are political moments. They are the system teaching people its boundaries. The early Principate also blurs the line between public and private power. In Republican tradition, influence is supposed to be expressed through public office. Under Augustus, influence is often expressed through proximity. Who gets invited, who gets introduced, who is seen as inside. And because the emperor's household controls proximity, the household's preferences ripple outward everywhere, quietly. A clerk's schedule shapes a senator's access. A senator's access shapes what other senators think is wise. What senators think is wise shapes what the city experiences as normal. If you want a simple image, picture a ladder leaning against a wall. The wall is the emperor. The ladder is everyone else. The ladder can look tall and impressive, but it only works if the wall stays where it is. That means the people on the ladder have an incentive to keep the wall stable, even if they complain about it in private. Stability is not just imposed, it is co-produced. And if you're not on the ladder, if you are a municipal delegation from Italy, or a businessman disputing a contract, or a veteran seeking a grant, then the Senate's adaptive behavior matters because it shapes the default answer you get. The safe range of outcomes narrows. You may still have rights, but you feel them as procedures, and procedures are run by officials who are watching the same incentives. So when we ask, who controlled Rome beyond the emperor? One answer is the elite culture that adapted to the new incentives, and the administrative class that translated those incentives into daily reality. They made the system feel normal, and normal is the strongest form of control. Let's get specific about the lever that connects all these layers: patronage. We often treat patronage like social fluff, rich guys helping friends, clients lining up at dawn, handshakes and favors. In early imperial Rome, patronage is infrastructure. It is how information moves, how trust is signaled, and how people cross boundaries they cannot cross alone. Here's the problem every Roman faces. The state is huge, the rules are complex, and the center's attention is scarce. If you are unknown, your petition looks like noise. If you are known, it looks like signal. A patron's job is to transform you from noise into signal. The transformation happens in small, concrete ways. A patron writes a recommendation. A patron introduces you to someone closer to the gate. A patron attaches his own reputation to your request. That is not charity. It is leverage. It tells gatekeepers, ignoring this person might cost you. And it tells you, the petitioner, you now owe a debt. Those debts are the glue of Roman society. They create durable networks that can outlive any single policy. And those networks become a parallel system of governance. If you want a permit, you don't just read a statute. You find the person who knows the clerk, who knows the official, who can interpret the statute in your favor. Again, dark comedy, but also accurate. The empire runs on relationships because relationships reduce uncertainty. Now watch how this plays out for our representative case. Ovid is already famous, which helps, but fame is not the same thing as access. Exile is, by definition, separation from the networks that matter. So Ovid writes to rebuild the network across distance. He sends letters that are carefully calibrated. He praises the emperor's virtues. He emphasizes his own loyalty. He reminds his correspondents of shared obligations. He asks them to mention him, to remember him, to place him back into the field of vision of the center. The key point is not the specific person who carried a letter. The key point is the logic. If the gate is controlled by people, then relationships with those people, or with people who can influence those people, are a form of power. That is why patrons, brokers, and intermediaries matter beyond the emperor. They are the transmission belt between private life and public outcomes. It also means that the same system can feel very different depending on who you are. If you are from an old senatorial family, you have patrons by default and clients to spare. If you are an equestrian official, you may have functional access through your job but limited social prestige. If you are a freedman with money, you may have cash but need legitimacy. If you are a provincial elite, you may have local influence but must translate it into Roman terms. Patronage is the translation service. You can see the social mechanics in the daily ritual of the salutatio, the morning greeting where clients gather at a patron's door. That line is not just about money. It is a public scoreboard. It tells the neighborhood who has influence, who is protected, and who can mobilize people. In a city where reputation is currency, a crowd at your doorway is a bank statement. Ovid's writing from exile also shows how patronage is performed in language. He doesn't just say, "Help me." He signals humility, shared history, and reciprocal obligation. He frames assistance as honorable for the helper and consistent with the regime's values. That's not random flattery. It is strategic communication designed for a culture where the wrong tone can close a door faster than a wrong fact. And here's a subtle point. Patronage doesn't only move favors upward. It moves discipline downward. When you owe a patron, you must act in ways that protect the patron's standing. That means you avoid actions that embarrass him. You adopt his political posture. You learn what topics are dangerous. Patronage becomes a social enforcement mechanism. It produces conformity without an official decree. At this point, you might think, so is Rome just corruption? Not exactly. Patronage is not a modern bribe economy. It is a moral system in Roman terms, tied to ideas of loyalty, obligation, and honor. That's why it is so powerful. People can sincerely believe they are acting virtuously, helping dependents, rewarding loyalty, while the same behavior also concentrates power and blocks outsiders. And this is where the imperial household and patronage intersect. Household staff have access, but they also have patrons. Senators have prestige, but they also need access. Administrators have authority, but they also need protection. Patronage knits them together. It turns a bureaucratic gate into a social gate. The result is a machine that is both official and personal at the same time. So when you ask who controlled Rome beyond the emperor, add another group to your list, the brokers of relationships, patrons, clients, and intermediaries who could open a path, close a path, or make you pay for the path with lifelong obligation. And for everyone outside the old elite, this mattered. A patron could make law feel like protection. No patron could make law feel like a locked gate, even when the text was fair. In the next segment, we'll add one more layer that makes these gates feel natural. Law and status, the categories that define who can act on their own and who must always go through someone else. Now we add a controller that doesn't wear a uniform and doesn't sit behind a desk. Status. Roman society is built on categories: free or enslaved, citizen or non-citizen, male or female, adult or minor, head of household or under someone's authority. Those categories are not just social labels. They are legal realities that determine who can act, who can own, who can sue, who can make contracts, and who must always act through someone else. This is why law is a gate. It doesn't have to shout to control you. It can simply require an extra step, an additional signature, a guardian, a representative, a witness of a certain rank. Each requirement creates a point where someone can say yes or no. And that someone is often not the emperor. It is a magistrate, a clerk, a tutor, a patron, or a family authority. Multiply that across a city of hundreds of thousands, and you get a society where choice is distributed unevenly by design. Under Augustus, this legal world also intersects with a moral and social program. The regime promotes a vision of restored order, and part of that vision involves regulating family life, marriage, children, inheritance incentives, and public honor. Ancient sources describe these measures as attempts to encourage certain behaviors among elites and to align private life with public values. Modern historians debate emphasis and effectiveness, but the core fact is clear. Law becomes a tool to reshape incentives, and incentives reshape behavior even when no one is watching. This matters for our theme because it expands control beyond politics in the narrow sense. Control becomes something you experience at the level of daily decisions: whom to marry, whether to have children, how to structure a household, how to present yourself in public. Even if you never see the emperor, you can feel the regime's priorities as a set of rewards and penalties. Now connect this back to Ovid without inventing details. We cannot prove exactly what his error was, but we can see the atmosphere in which a poem and an error could be politically explosive. If the regime is presenting itself as moral renewal, a prominent voice that mocks, complicates, or undermines that narrative becomes risky. Some scholars argue that the poet's earlier work on love and seduction sat awkwardly with a moral program. Others argue that the error suggests proximity to sensitive court politics. The responsible point is not to pick a favorite theory. The responsible point is to see how moral messaging, reputation, and power can collide. And this is where inequality becomes acceptable, or at least tolerable, to many people. After years of civil war, stability is attractive. A system that delivers peace, predictable careers, and functioning markets can earn compliance even while it limits speech and concentrates decision-making. People accept inequality not because they are blind, but because they calculate costs. If the price of challenging the structure is chaos, many will choose adaptation. That brings us to another huge lever: provisioning. A metropolis survives on supply chains, especially grain. Keep the grain moving, and the city stays calm. Let it fail, and politics becomes a crisis overnight. Managing supply is therefore managing legitimacy. Again, the emperor is the symbol, but the work is done by administrators, ship contractors, warehouse officials, and record keepers. Control of essentials turns governance into something you can literally eat or not eat. Finally, security. The early Principate maintains order through institutions that are often visible only as presence: guards, patrols, and the knowledge that the state can intervene. Most days, that intervention doesn't happen, and that is precisely the point. The goal is not constant force. It is predictable boundaries. Predictable boundaries train people to self-police. You lower your voice. You choose your words. You avoid the wrong joke. You decide not to push the wrong motion. The system doesn't need to punish everyone. It needs everyone to imagine punishment is possible. Think about the household as a legal unit. The father's authority over family property and decisions can make a private choice into a legal constraint for everyone under that roof. Think about women's legal position, which varies by circumstance but often involves forms of guardianship or male mediation in formal transactions. Think about freed people who can gain wealth and influence yet still carry legal and social marks of origin. Think about non-citizens who may live in the city, work, worship, and serve, yet still face limits in formal status. In each case, law and custom decide whether you can walk through the gate alone. And don't forget ideology. Building programs, public rituals, and the language of restoration help people feel that the current order is natural and beneficial. When monuments say peace, and the streets are in fact peaceful, the message sticks. Soft power makes hard structures easier to live with. Normal can be the strongest cage. So here's the punchline of this segment. Who controlled Rome beyond the emperor? Law and status did. Not as abstractions, but as practical gates that required mediation. Provisioning did. Security did. And all these levers were operated by people with names you rarely see in big textbooks: officials, clerks, brokers, household staff, whose daily decisions made imperial power feel like the weather, always there, shaping everything and hard to argue with. All right, time to make it mechanical. If you're the kind of person who likes diagrams, this is your moment. We're going to answer clearly and quickly how the system worked, because the whole point of the episode is that power in early imperial Rome was not just a personality. It was a structure. Who had power? At the top, Augustus held bundled authority and prestige. That is the peak. But directly beneath the peak sat multiple power-holding groups. The senatorial elite still mattered. They held status, governed provinces, judged cases, and shaped norms. Alongside them, equestrian officials and prefects managed key systems: finance, supply, and urban administration. Threaded through everything was the imperial household: secretaries, clerks, attendants, and doorkeepers who controlled access, timing, and information flow. If you want beyond the emperor, these are your suspects, and they don't have to conspire to matter. They just have to do their jobs. How they enforce power? Most of the time, not with drama. Enforcement looked like routine. Appointments made careers. Permissions made businesses possible. Petitions and replies decided exceptions. Courts decided reputation. Schedules decided whether your problem became urgent or became invisible. Even when force exists in the background, daily control was usually achieved through administrative friction and social incentives. The state didn't need to shout when it could simply slow you down. What laws and rules mattered most for our story? Status rules. They determined who could act on their own and who required mediation, by a guardian, a household authority, or a patron. Social legislation and moral messaging mattered too, because they reshaped incentives around marriage, children, and honor. And just as important as written law was interpretation: how officials applied rules, how strictly they read documents, and how much discretion they used when no one was watching. How did all of this affect everyday life? It turned rights into processes. It turned independence into negotiation. It trained people to think in pathways. Who do I know who can introduce me? Which office handles this? What phrasing is safest? What is the acceptable range of outcomes? For the ordinary person, it meant lines, delays, fees, and the need for a sponsor. For elites, it meant managing speech, aligning with the center, and avoiding reputational risk. Different levels, same logic, access controls outcomes. Why did people accept inequality? Because the system traded it for stability. After civil war, predictability is valuable. A regime that keeps the city fed, keeps the streets calm, and keeps careers and honors flowing can be experienced as a relief. Inequality becomes tolerable when it feels normal, and when challenging it feels dangerous or futile. And the regime's story, restoration, peace, moral renewal, helps people rationalize the bargain. Now bring it back to Ovid and close the loop. Ovid is famous, educated, connected. Yet once the gates close, he is negotiating with the machine. He writes, he asks, he flatters. He depends on intermediaries. He learns that in this world, the decisive question is not, am I right? It is, can I reach the person who can help me? And can I do it in a way that makes helping me safe? That is why Ovid's Exile is the perfect real-world hook for our theme. It shows that imperial power is not just the emperor's will. It is the chain that carries the will into reality. Household gatekeepers, patrons, administrators, senatorial incentives, and the managers of stability. Cut one link, access, and even a celebrity becomes small. Modern takeaway, non-political. If you want to understand who runs any system, don't just look at the person at the top. Look at who controls the gates. Scheduling, paperwork, standards, introductions, and the ability to delay. The person who can make you wait can often make you comply. One historian's caution before we end. When we describe this machine, we're describing tendencies, not a single switch labeled tyranny. The emperor could respond to petitions and act through recognized channels, and that made the system feel legitimate. At the same time, the same channels created dependence and fear of being misread. Both realities can coexist. A bureaucracy can be orderly and intimidating at the same time. Add public building, rituals, and the language of peace, and you get soft power reinforcing hard gates. You don't have to love the system to live inside it. You just have to learn its pathways. If you want a final human button, it's this: Ovid's last great fight is not in a forum. It's in tone. He rewrites himself in letters, more humble, more careful, more loyal, because in a gatekeeper world, tone is strategy. And yes, that is painfully relatable. Most of us have written an email where we delete 3 honest sentences and replace them with, just circling back, because we know the gate is a person with a mood. Rome just did it with wax tablets. So when you ask who controlled Rome, remember, the emperor decided, but the gates delivered, and delivery was done by people, every day, quietly. If you want the next episode to zoom in on one gate, patronage, the imperial household, the Senate's incentive shift, or the mechanics of petitions, drop one word in the comments. And if you want more Rome explained without myths, hit subscribe.